A crystal glass caught the chandelier's light and fractured it into 100 small stars. For a moment, the room blinked. Laughter, clinking silver, a flow of champagne. Then the hum pulled back like a tide, and one voice, measured and calm, cut through the noise in a language most in the room did not expect. Ich habe jedes Wort verstanden. I understood every word. The sentence hung between rows of tuxedos and silk, as ordinary and impossible as a single clear bell in a crowded city square. Cameras pivoted, phones tilted. A ripple of air moved across the marble floor as if the room itself had drawn breath. David Cole had said it. He stood near the back edge of the VIP room in a rented vest that still smelled faintly of the dry cleaner's starch. At 34, he carried the kind of wear that comes from hands that work for a living. Oil under the nails, a slight stiffness at the knuckle of his right index finger, where he kept a lifelong reminder of a stubborn bolt. Beside him, 8-year-old Lila Cole, small in a borrowed dress 2 sizes too large, blinked at the sudden attention, the coin she'd been fingering momentarily forgotten in her palm. At the far side of the room, Clara Eisenberg's laugh caught and dissolved. She had been leaning toward a friend when she spoke, soft German clipped with an upper-class edge, the kind of voice that had the advantage of assuming other people were not listening because they couldn't be expected to understand. Schau dir diese Leute an, she had said, dismissive, then something sharper under her breath. Leela, who had been close enough to see Clara's silver necklace glitter, had asked, wide-eyed, "What does it say?" Clara answered in German, quick and small, a phrase intended to land like a closing door. Das ist nur etwas Altes, nicht für Kinder. It's just an old thing, not for children. David's fingers tightened on a worn leather book that had been soft from being opened and read 1,000 times. Anna Weber's notebook. Anna, his late wife, whose handwriting filled margins with tiny, stubborn loops, and whose language lessons were more love letters than grammar exercises. He had brought it as a precaution, a little portable shrine, a way to hold on to something that made them whole when the rest of the world tried to make them small. You mistake money for class, he said, quietly, in English first, and then softer so that only the immediate semicircle could hear. Du verwechselst Geld mit Anstand. You mistake money for decency. It was not a shout. It was not a retort aimed at humiliation. It was a statement of fact, edged in the steady care he had toward his daughter. The room pivoted from curiosity to shock. A single, simple sentence said in another tongue, spoken with the certainty of someone who had lived inside it. Clara's face flushed, not with the easy chagrin of someone caught in social awkwardness, but with the sudden, clean recognition of being seen. Her eyes darted down to the coin in Lila's hand, the silver-doled piece she'd just found by the doorway and tucked away like a small secret. The coin glinted with a crest Lila could not name. It felt older than everything in the room. A camera mic swung closer. The auction live stream, a sleek banner on the left of a dozen phone screens, snapped to life. At once voices layered. Moderator whispers, a reporter's first question, the flurry of live chat plastered with emoticons. Someone somewhere typed, "Wait, he speaks German?" Another, "Is he donating?" The scene was flattening into a dozen small narratives already. David eased a hand into his coat, feeling for the familiar weight of Anna's notebook and the memory of her voice guiding him through verbs he'd long ago promised to keep alive for Lila. He did not raise his voice to the room. He did not make a spectacle. His German was not meant as a blow, but as a bridge. Yet bridges in rooms built on assumptions can feel like indictments. "If that necklace has a line attributed to Goethe," he said, his German precise, the syllables clear and unhurried. "Das Zitat stammt nicht von Goethe, sondern von Heinrich Heine. That line doesn't come from Goethe, it's by Heinrich Heine." The correction landed with the simple authority of someone who'd read both men with attention, Not the recitation of a scholar, but the quiet certainty of a person who had listened to his wife read verses aloud over the sink at midnight. Clara's mouth formed the shape of a word that never left her lips. Lila tugged at his sleeve. "Daddy," she said, small and immediate. "Is she mad?" "She's surprised," David said, folding his hand around the notebook like a shield and a pillow. "Surprises can be sharp." An early CTA, a gentle nudge, rose from the narrator's tone like the soft clearing of a throat. If you've ever seen someone judged for how they looked, leave a note in the comments. Say how it felt when someone surprised you. It was the kind of request that asked for more than vanity. It asked for humility in a world that forgot how to be surprised for the right reasons. Hearts in the room beat at the speed of the cameras now. Reporters in neat black suits muttered into microphones, thinking in their heads about frames and quotes. Social feeds curdled and opened with new angles. "Single dad shuts down heiress," wrote one headline. The room could already feel forming. Others cautioned, in smaller, steadier fonts, "Wait, context matters." David had not come to the gala for any of this. He had been invited as the anonymous donor of one item, and as a recent widow and single father who had once taught with Anna at a small community program that the wider cultural trust occasionally supported. He wore shoes he had polished late the night before, while Lila slept against his chest, and the leather notebook lay open on the kitchen table like a promise. He had rehearsed a simple line, "Why people give, why memory matters." But rehearsal is brittle in a room that expects spectacle. Clara's friends murmured, their laughter a hushed rope to pull her back into the fold. She had been raised inside foundations and endowments where generosity often came with press releases and nameplates. She had worn the necklace for years, and perhaps she had meant nothing cruel. Her comment may have been nothing more than a reflex, the privileged misstep of someone removed from the classroom where ink stains were the measure of worth. But being seen slices the automatic into something that must be accounted for. David moved then, not grandly, but with the same care he always used with Lila, low and deliberate. He crouched so his eyes were level with his daughter's, the action softening the entire tableau. "Would you like to know what it says?" he asked Lila in English, thumbs gently brushing the coin she still held. Lila nodded. Up close, her cheeks were warm and freckled, eyes hungry for stories. She had been the first to find the coin earlier that evening, a dull disc tucked in the cracks of the marble steps outside, as if it had been waiting for a small hand to pull it free. She had slipped it into her pocket like contraband, then curiously asked about the necklace. David inhaled. "It's an old crest, like a family stamp. We'll look it up when we get home." He did not elaborate. Home for him was a 2-bedroom apartment above his garage, where the smell of motor oil mingled with Anna's lavender soap, and where he'd taught Lila the guttural R of Wasser and the soft diminutive of Schatz. The sound of Anna's voice returned like a tide, not a recording, not a memory recited for show, but a cadence he could still feel, patient, exact, full of small, untheatrical joy. She taught because language for her had been the way she tethered what she loved to others. She taught in classrooms that did not bubble with crystal, where children wore catalogued uniforms and thumbs colored the margins of notebooks yellow, and she had saved coins like talismans from schoolyard scavenges. He remembered watching her fold a teaching exercise into a love note and then seal it between pages like a secret. The flashback came in fragments. Anna standing at a chalkboard in a cramped Berlin classroom, hair in a loose bun, teaching verbs with songs. Anna in their kitchen with flour on her hands, showing David the correct inflection. Lila at 3, standing on a chair to reach Anna's shoulder and giggling as the whole sentence crumpled into nonsense. Each image was small but exact, like the brushstrokes of a painting. When they first found the coin, it had been a day like any other, except that it wasn't. Lila had crawled under the park bench and returned with it, triumphant. Anna had turned it over like a jeweler, the metal warmed by her palm. "Weber," she said softly, reading the tiny embossed crest, the same crest now catching the light against Lila's palm. Anna traced the letters, as if they described a face she knew. Weber, she repeated, the name a string of vowels that tasted like home. Anna wrote in that notebook everything she taught them. There were lesson plans, little poems, grocery lists turned pedagogical devices, and love notes folded into grammar exercises. The leather had been smoothed in the corners by a thumb that pointed to verbs at midnight and doodled a face in the margins when thoughts wandered. David read it as part manual, part map. It explained more than syntax. It explained what Anna thought was important: attention, patience, the ritual of showing up. Back in the present, the back channel in the room had transformed from amused chatter to the thin, hot wire of rumor. Reporters edged closer. A young woman in a gray blazer asked David if he had come to bid on behalf of someone. Another man with a small camera puffed questions about the notebook, the coin, Anna's name. David's answers were short and careful, his voice a low current that moved even the microphones. This was Anna's husband and daughter, he said, finally, testing the words before letting them land. We brought something that belonged to her. There it was, a phrase that rearranged expectations. Not a wealthy patron closing a gap with a check, but two people who had been keeping a private history alive. Already the crowd began to tilt, people adjusting their lenses to the new light, measuring their laughter against this fact. Clara's face hardened into something like calculation, the old reflex to move toward control. The auctioneer cleared his throat at the podium, the practiced cadence of someone trained to shape attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, and the rooms leaned in. "We have many fine lots tonight, and a special piece will be offered shortly. A final work from a recently deceased artist has been consigned for charity." Lila's coin felt hot in her hand. Without thinking, she reached into the pocket of her dress and laid the small, blunt circle on the auction table, as if laying down a pebble on an old map. It rolled on its edge and caught, just for a blink, the light that shivered off the chandelier. The auctioneer's eyes flicked to the coin and then to David. The cameras, professional and amateur alike, shifted to frame the moment like a stage director seizing a new beat. "This piece," the auctioneer continued, voice polishing the moment, "is a landscape titled Homeland on the Rhine. The artist's handwriting appears on the back." The words felt absurdly small and precise. "We were fortunate to have such a donation for tonight." David's thumb brushed the edge of the leather notebook in his inside pocket. The cover was warm and faintly soiled by years of thumbprints. He had not expected the painting to be the centerpiece. He had assumed, naively, that whoever consigned it might be one of the usual donors, someone who gave with a flourish. In his mind, the painting belonged to the private sphere of memory. It was Anna's, he knew by the way light bent in the hills, by the particular scrawl of her signature. But he had never intended to unfold the whole of their life in a room already set to judge and be judged. A murmur made its way through the crowd, an undercurrent of anticipation. Someone took a photo of Lila's coin against the polished wood, and the image appeared on screens almost immediately. Comments cascaded. "Is that the same crest? Could it be her painting? Did he donate it?" Clara's voice, when it came, was quieter than before, lower, with a new note: curiosity. "Anna Weber," she said, too loud to be merely a thought. The syllables reached more ears than she intended. A pause. The auctioneer's smile tightened into a professional neutrality. "We will present Lot 12 shortly," he said. David's hand, without thought, lifted the corner of the leather binding and let a single page fall open. Inked across the margin in Anna's narrow script was a line of an old nursery rhyme she'd taught Lila. The handwriting leaned in, patient and familiar, the perfect domestic scrawl of someone who tended words the way others tended gardens. A reporter, already close, reached out to photograph the page. The clicks of shutters were now the percussion to a new rhythm. Clara was no longer merely in the room. She was in front of the mirror of her own assumptions. She had recognized a name, but recognition is larger than memory. It is the sudden sense that a person once passed by you with a kindness that you mistook for ordinary, and then, when stripped of that anonymity, reveals the depth of what you took for granted. David cleared his throat, and the room leaned toward him again, impatient for the soundbite. He folded the notebook closed before anyone could put it under a spotlight like an artifact on a plinth. His choice to close it was not secrecy so much as protection. Certain things lose their shape under the glare. She taught, he said, simple and blunt, at the Berlin International School program that our trust supports. That name, fictional in their world, real enough in memory, carried weight. It anchored Anna not in fame, but in practice. In classrooms where children learned language because a woman loved to teach them. Reporters scribbled. The camera feeds multiplied. The live stream chat bloomed with questions. Was she the artist? Is he the donor? Can we see the painting? The social media algorithm loved tension. It loved the elegiac thread of a late artist whose work might now enter the market or be turned into something larger. People already imagined headlines. David's shoulders did not rise. He had rehearsed silence and had learned to let it do the heavy work for him. He had rehearsed, too, for the possibility of humiliation, those small, sharp social perfidia that watch like hawks for the moments when dignity yields. But what he had not rehearsed were the stories that open because a child drops a coin and an old name is remembered. Someone cleared their throat, and the auctioneer, sensing the temperature in the room, adjusted the evening script. Lot 12 will be offered in 10 minutes, he announced, his tone smoothing the edge of the sudden personal. While we prepare the piece, we invite the next lot. The cameras pivoted out like a school of fish, returning briefly to champagne and appetizers. Yet the room did not relax. Questions arced between groups like electrical charge. Did the painting belong to this family? Would it be sold to the highest bidder? Or would it be donated? The unknown thickened into possibility. Clara's eyes found David again, and for the first time since the night had begun, there was something like shame nudging at the edges of her composure. She touched the silver at her throat as if anchoring herself. There was the dangerous second when remorse can be performative, a staged set piece. And there was the harder, quieter second when it is real and messy. The room, which had been hungry for spectacle, watched to see which it would be. David knelt beside Leela, the movement small and almost invisible under the chandeliers. He took her hand and, in the hush that now filled the spaces between conversations, whispered a line from Anna's notebook, one of those silly grammar jingles that Anna used to make her students sing. Kleine Schritte, he said in German, small steps. Leela repeated it in a whisper, the two words rolling off her tongue like practice and promise both. Across the room, a camera found Clara's profile and held it. The shot lingered on her hand, tightening around the stem of a glass, the knuckles whitening. She was very young to carry such inherited cruelties. She had been raised to believe certain advantages were invisible and thus unaccountable. But tonight, the invisible had become visible, and the light showed the veneer's thinness. On a side table, someone had placed a framed photograph of the late artist, a woman with kind eyes and a paint-splattered scarf. The picture, propped like an afterthought next to an array of hors d'oeuvres, looked small and intimate against the sleek modernity of the room. David's gaze navigated its edges briefly, a small, private thing that did not translate well into sound bites. There, in the tiny oval of a smile, was the reason for the notebook, the coin, the whispered German. There was the yardstick by which he measured what mattered. He rose when the auctioneer stepped down from the podium to confer with the curator. The murmuring thickened again. He could feel the room pressing curiosity into expectation, people ready to be entertained or instructed, or both. He could feel Clara's eyes on him like the shadow of a question. The auctioneer announced a brief intermission to set the lighting for Lot 12. A soft orchestral track began to play, the room taking a breath and smoothing itself. Phones began to buzz with notifications. David felt the weight of where they stood, not purely as guests tonight, but as carriers of a story the room had stumbled onto. He had come to donate what he thought was right, Anna's last painting, a private memorial given to a public cause. He had not come to be the lesson in someone else's morality play. But the evening had a way of shaping events into moral theater whether people wanted it or not. He tucked the notebook more securely into his coat and moved toward the exit to step into the air for Lila, who needed a quiet moment away from the lights. As they moved, a hand was already extended, microphone and recorder in a single movement, someone asking the same question that had floated around the room since David had spoken German. "Sir, are you here to bid on the painting yourself?" For a moment he hesitated. He could have deflected with a joke, a wry smile, a refusal softened into civility. Instead, he answered with the kind of honesty that had kept him moving through grief. "I'm here to make sure her art goes where it will do the most good." That answer, as plain as it was, carried the load of choices not yet made. Cameras cropped in, social feeds flared. Clara watched from her table, the silver at her throat catching the light like a question mark. The intermission stretched, and the room drifted like a tide. People checked watches and screens, adjusted napkins, retied ties. In pockets and beside purses, phones glowed with updates and speculations. The narrative had found its first heartbeat, the moment of revelation, yet its second act had not started. Outside, cool air washed down the building's stone steps where Lila had earlier found the coin. They paused for a breath of the night. The city smelled of late tulips and taxi exhaust. Lila held the coin up to the light, turning it. The imprint was faint but legible, a crest she could not yet read as a name, but which seemed to pulse with history. "Daddy," she asked, voice small in the night, "do we know her?" David looked at the coin, then at the skyline where neon signs reflect like a promise. "We did know her," he said, and the tense of the verb felt important. "And we keep knowing her, every time we say a word she taught, every time we practice." Lila tucked the coin into his palm then, trusting him to keep it safe. They walked back into the humid glow of the gala together. As they re-entered, phones resumed their tracking, the room resuming the energy of expectation. The painting would be revealed soon. People would want to know who owned the work, who consigned it, who would pay. The answers could reshape the evening's narrative into reconciliation or into something more explosive. The light in the room seemed to gather itself for that revealing. David straightened, smoothing the rented vest that felt a shade too formal for the life he knew. He opened the notebook, but only to the first page that Anna had marked with a loose scrap of paper. In her handwriting, a single, small line read, "For Lila. May the small words grow into bridges." He smiled then, an almost invisible thing that told Lila everything she needed, that bridges are built slowly, by hands that are willing to steady themselves, by people who translate care into action. The auctioneer tapped the microphone again. The room hushed. Clara let out a breath that sounded almost like a prayer. The spotlight pivoted toward the stage. The painting, Lot 12, hung behind the curtain like a secret. Cameras zoomed. Lila's coin lay warm in David's pocket. When the curtain rose, the light cut across oil and canvas, and the name beneath the signature was small and precise. For a heartbeat, the room did not move, each person measuring what the signature meant. David felt the air change in a way that suggested the story would no longer belong to them privately. He had raised his hand once earlier, not in a dramatic bid, merely an involuntary lift as if signaling to someone in the crowd. Now, as the painting unveiled and the catalog turned the page glowing with Anna's name, something in him shifted. He had promised a life to Lila that honored the past without burning bridges. The choice in front of him was not merely about money. It was about whether the world that had laughed because they wore a rented vest could be made to understand the language of a life. He pressed his thumb into the leather of the notebook, feeling the indentation of a past night when Anna had traced her name into a blank page, and whispered, "If anything happens," and he had cut her off with a laugh and a terrible, brittle bravery. Now, the words sat in his ribcage like ballast and compass. The auctioneer lifted his paddle for the opening bid. Cameras tightened on David, on Clara, on the painting that had smelled of turpentine and late afternoons. Live chat streams hummed, "Is he the owner? Is he bidding? Please let it be donated." David looked at Leela, whose small face was open and unafraid, who carried in her palm a coin and in her mouth the syllables of grammar lessons made of lullabies. He closed his hand, and before his rational mind could step in and make calculations, he lifted a paddle of his own. A dozen screens froze on the moment. A single raised hand in a rented vest, a father bidding in a room that had expected spectacle, the paint of a life newly visible on a public stage. The paddle felt heavier than plastic should, weighted with a quiet resolve that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with dignity. The room leaned forward. Breath flattened into one note. The auctioneer's voice steadied, soft and professional. "Do I have an opening bid?" he asked. David's mouth formed words that would be captured into headlines and remembered in some corners as defiant. He did not know yet if the later parts of the night would bring repair or shame or both, but in his chest he carried a conviction that some things were not for sale to the highest bidder. The first paddle click echoed like a bell, the room inhaled. The first paddle click answered like a question thrown into a quiet room. For a breath, the auctioneer's practiced smile held steady. Then bids came, low at first, polite, then faster, sharper, shaped by the electric curiosity that had been lit in everyone's chests. A woman in emerald raised her paddle. A man near the orchestra pit countered. The numbers climbed, and with each registered increase, the room's posture rebalanced. Private memory now measured in currency. David felt the motion of the sale like a tide around him. He had not thought of the painting as an object to be priced. It was a last afternoon, a bowl of light, a brush stroke that smelled faintly of turpentine and lemon soap. Still, hands were in motion and people were watching. He glanced at Leela. She gripped his coat sleeve with her small, certain fingers. Her eyes were bright, as if at the center of a play she didn't fully understand, but trusted her father to lead. 1,000, the auctioneer called, and the paddle clicks multiplied. 1,005, a voice, crisp, a higher hand. The bids rose, the auditorium's gossip trailing the numbers like confetti. A live stream caption tunneled in the corner of dozens of screens, Lot 12, Homeland on the Rhine, attributed to A. Weber. The chat exploded with half-formed theories and urgent curiosity. Is the owner here? Will it be donated? The algorithm fed itself on tension. David eased his hand into his coat and felt the notebook's leather. He could have stepped back, let the work be sold to the highest bidder, and let his private mourning remain private. That had been the plan. But as the numbers climbed, something else moved in him. A refusal to let Anna's last conversation with the world be reduced to an auctioneer's gavel without intention. He held the paddle until his arm ached. Each increment was a small testimony. He would not let the evening define the story they had been living. When the auctioneer's eyes swept the room and landed on David, there was a ripple of recognition that carried its own moral weight. The microphone picked up the rustle of silk and the sharp inhale of an audience leaning into the moment. "Do I have 2,000?" the auctioneer asked. A woman in pearls called. Another bid. The number climbed, and the cameras prepared to freeze the tableau. In a seat near Clara, someone was already recording. Their lens framed Clara's throat like a punctuation mark. Then, as if to puncture the glossy shot the room had been composing, a low voice near the podium asked a question that shifted the geometry of the moment. "Sir," the reporter from earlier said, moving in with practiced gentleness, "if you are the donor, will you confirm we may announce it now?" David's hand tightened on the paddle. He looked at the faces arrayed in tears, people who, moments ago, had been shaping polite assumptions, and then at Leela, whose chin was dusted with the faintest freckles. He inhaled and let the words fall simply. "The painting belongs to us," he said. "It's Anna's." He pronounced the name as a benediction. The microphones closed in, the cameras leaned forward, and for the second time that night, the room shifted from entertainment to recognition. A murmur passed through the audience that was not only surprise, but the slow, private recalibration of those who had been comfortable with surfaces. Someone near the back whispered, "He owns it," as if repeating a fact to make it more true. The auctioneer, having navigated many dramatic turns, adjusted his script in a heartbeat. "We've been informed," he said, his voice regaining the steady cadence of someone who knows how to steward attention, "that Lot 12 has been donated by the family. It will be sold tonight for the benefit of the Weber Cultural Trust and the programs it supports." The last two names were carefully chosen, familiar enough to give the event its charitable gravitas, specific enough to anchor Anna's legacy in practice. In the pause that followed, some patrons sat back, measuring the shift. Others leaned forward, eager for the new twist. David lowered his paddle. He did not smile. There was no performance in the moment. He simply set down plastic, as if returning a tool that had been needed only to get attention. The room's appetite for spectacle turned, briefly, into a single question. What did the family want to do with the painting? Before David could answer, a small commotion by the stage drew eyes. A curator in a navy suit holding up a magnifying lens to the lower right corner of the canvas. He squinted, then turned the painting very slightly so the room could see a barely visible mark near the frame. A watermark, an emblem pressed into the gesso that matched nothing the eye expected in the slick, polished world of high society provenance. Someone near the lighting board zoomed in with a camera, and the image flared across screens. A faint stamp in the corner, a crest with a tiny lion and the letters WEBER curling around it. The watermark caught like a secret. The live captions adjusted. EMBD, Weber crest, matched. The chatter swelled. At the same moment, a camera angle caught Leela's coin as she held it up under the table's lamp. A production assistant in the front row snagged the shot and sent it to the studio feed. The coin's small crest, scuffed but unmistakable, appeared next to the painting's watermark on split screen. Two identical marks, separated by decades, now spoke with a blunt clarity. Clara's expression moved through a chain. First curiosity, then a memory's bright flash, then the softening of a face that had worn certainty like armor. The necklace at her throat trembled as if it had weight beyond metal. She had not expected to be unmoored tonight. And yet, the image of a younger teacher leaning over a note, of a woman who'd spoken to her in a small classroom in Berlin, came up in her mind like a photograph blown from its frame. She rose before anyone could offer words. Her footsteps were quick, but not theatrical. The room hushed as if one collective breath had been held, waiting to see whether this would be another scene of spectacle or a moment of repair. Clara approached David with hands that did not quite find steadiness. She dropped to her knees with a sound like someone surrendering the last of their pretense. It was not a show. It was the simple physical lowering of someone finally undertaking the work their conscience required. "Es tut mir leid," she said in German, voice breaking. "I am sorry." The translation, soft and immediate, threaded through the room. "I am sorry." David looked at her for a long second. He saw not only regret, but a tangible willingness to step into restitution. Leela watched from his side, eyes large and open. Around them, cameras recorded the unvarnished moment. A young heiress kneeling before a working father. History and pride bowed to a memory that mattered more. Clara's apologies spilled out, halting and earnest. "Anna was my teacher," she said. "She taught me when I was small. She gave me this necklace." Her fingers touched the silver at her throat, as if renewing a promise she had once taken lightly. She faltered, the rest of the sentence unnecessary under the weight of her shame and the clarity of the coin beside them. "I remember," she continued, "the afternoons in that classroom, the way she made us say words until they sounded like home. I thought," she looked at David, her gaze unblinking, "I thought I understood what it meant to give. I was wrong." She rose slowly and offered the necklace into David's hands. The movement was a small, concrete offering. The crowd exhaled collectively. The microphones stopped their rustling like birds pausing mid-flight. David took the necklace with fingers that had touched paint-splattered brushes and warmed steering wheels. He did not place it on Leela or keep it for himself. He held it between both palms as if it were a small living thing, not property but testimony. Leela reached out and laid her small hand on the medallion, and in that quiet, the room heard a different currency pass: accountability. Did Anna give it to you?" David asked, not with accusation, but with the simple curiosity of a husband hearing a new part of his wife's story. "Yes," Clara said. "She said it would remind me to be kind. I forgot the meaning." Her voice was thin, but the apology extended beyond words into action. She turned toward the auctioneer and the assembled guests. "I want to fund a program in her name, a scholarship, a language program for children who never thought they would get one, a handbook that captures the little exercises she taught us, so it's not just money, but method." The room's response was quickening, murmurs becoming assent, heads nodding. This was no officious pledge for a press release. Clara spoke with the rough honesty of someone making amends they intended to keep. She had the resources to attach real support to her words, and she offered them deliberately. A scholarship seeded by her family office, a commitment to underwrite a workshop series for the Berlin International School program that Anna had loved, and a grant to preserve Anna's teaching notes as a public resource. Careful, practical steps to turn apology into structure. David's reply was measured. He could have refused, to keep the necklace in private, to keep grief free of public ceremony. But the man inside him was a teacher now in his own right, a guardian of a legacy that had once belonged to two people. He placed Anna's notebook on the auction table where the painting's documentation lay and, with a quiet voice, accepted Clara's proposal with one condition: that Anna's methods remain intact, not streamlined into market-ready slogans, and that Leela and he be given a place in shaping the program, so the work stayed faithful to the woman who had made it. "That seems right," he said. "If we're remembering her, let it be with what she taught, her lessons, not our versions of them." Clara nodded, the room absorbing the two adults' practical allegiance to the work Anna had loved. Reporters leaned forward like flowers to the sun. Social feeds lit up with one-word threads: apology, restitution, program, and tens of thousands of eyes watched as the arc of the night bent towards something that felt like repair. The auctioneer, regaining his ceremonial rhythm, but now with a new set of charges, logistics, provenance, and the trust's requisite paperwork, announced that Lot 12 would be sold and the proceeds directed to the new memorial fund. The bidders, their motives a mixture of philanthropy and acquisitive taste, resumed their positions. The paddle clicks resumed, now underscored by a softer, more purposeful reason. When the final gavel fell, the painting had a buyer who represented a local museum interested in exhibiting Anna's work, temporarily, before transferring it to the new program's fundraising tour. The transfer, Clara announced within earshot of the microphones, would include a public show in which Anna's teaching materials, including the leather notebook, would be featured as part of an exhibit on community pedagogy. The Weber Cultural Trust agreed to steward the scholarship's administration. It was, in the slow calculus of the room, a tidy closing. But tidiness was not what the night had delivered. It had handed a complicated human exchange. Apology threaded with action, grief braided with public responsibility. Cameras continued to click, but the heat of sensation had settled into the more durable warmth of purpose. After the event, cameras and reporters loosened like a tide. People spoke in softer tones, their conversations circling the moral heart of the evening. Clara remained near David and Leela, hands frequently folded as if in prayer. Reporters requested statements. The two adults crafted them into sentences that could translate across airwaves. "We will set up the Anna Weber Memorial Language Program," Clara told the cameras, carefully in English. Then, turning slightly to David, she added in German a phrase she had kept from small child to adult, folding the language of the classroom back into the night. "Danke, Anna, für alles." Thank you, Anna, for everything. David watched her mouth the words and saw not only the student she had been, but the adult she had chosen to become. He felt the notebook warm in his inner pocket and held the knowledge that their next work, the program, the handbook, the exhibitions, would be less about spectacle and more about the daily practice of teaching. The days that followed stretched like an unraveling ribbon of small, steady labor. Contracts were written. The painting was moved under museum guard into a climate-controlled crate, then photographed, cataloged, and prepared for the exhibit that would tour local community centers and schools. The Weber Cultural Trust set up an advisory board that included teachers who had worked with Anna, community leaders, and a representative from Clara's philanthropic office. David and Clara met twice to go over curriculum drafts, reading the notebook together and arguing gently over whether a particular exercise fit the students they hoped to reach. Small things mattered. Leela's pronunciation of a diminutive endearment became the lead example in a children's booklet. Clara insisted the scholarship include funds for classroom supplies, paper, paintbrushes, and old-fashioned notebooks, so students would learn not only words but the tactile work Anna loved. David insisted that the handbook's exercises be field-tested in real classes, not just curated for donors. Each choice, deliberate and modest, spoke more to the legacy than any plaque ever could. News outlets followed the arc. Headlines edged from "Single Dad Shocks Audience" to "Heiress Funds Memorial Program" to "Community Reconciliation Through Language," a narrative arc the Internet learned to love. Humiliation, apology, action. But underneath the headlines, the work was slow and local. Teachers convened. Children brought their own small talismans. Donors met with classroom coordinators. The first scholarships were awarded to children from neighborhoods that had previously lacked consistent language resources. The program's logo, a simple, stylized crest inspired by the watermark but not a copy, appeared on tote bags, lesson plans, and a small flyer that read, in Anna's favored crisp handwriting, "Kleine Schritte. Big words begin small." Clara did not retreat to the comforts of anonymity. She gave a public apology at a press conference 2 weeks later, a clear, unsentimental statement in which she named the harm her offhand words had caused, acknowledged the ways her upbringing had shaped blind spots, and outlined concrete commitments. Funding for 5 years of scholarships, underwriting the restoration and exhibition of Anna's painting, and the production of a practical handbook built from Anna's notebooks with portions translated for classroom use. She handed David a draft of the proposed manual and, as cameras clicked, said plainly that she hoped to learn from him as much as to fund the program. "It was never enough to say I'm sorry," she said. "We must do the labor of repair." The press listened. Some commentators were skeptical. How often did rich apologies actually lead to change? But many teachers and former students reached out with messages of welcome. Those voices mattered in the same way that small student exercises mattered. They were the proof that the program's heartbeat was not PR, but practice. Meanwhile, the coin took on a role it had not expected. Leela had insisted she wear it to the first committee meeting, the little disc on a homemade string beneath a modest dress. The image of a small girl with a weathered coin and a silver necklace, both symbols newly worn as bridges, went into the brochure. The coin's imprint was studied by archivists who cross-referenced it with photo archives and found handwritten receipts showing Anna buying supplies from a small Berlin market where she'd once taught, a tidy human link that made the watermark less an artifact and more a stamped life. Weeks turned into a month. The museum exhibit opened to a modest but earnest crowd: teachers, families, supporters from the trust, curious citizens, and the live stream audience that had followed the story from the beginning. Anna's painting hung at the center, flanked by pages from the leather notebook, photocopied, facsimiled, spot-repaired, displayed with a curator's reverence that felt like respect rather than appraisement. Small video interviews played in the background, featuring teachers who had worked with Anna saying simply what they had learned from her: how to make verbs into games, how to fold a lesson into a song, how to treat a student as someone already carrying a whole language inside them. Clara stood near the entrance, wearing the necklace, now polished and laid against her sternum like an emblem of a vow. She had aged subtly in those weeks. The forced smoothness of her previous public persona had been worn in places by the friction of honest work. She had, in a handful of public appearances, hosted classroom workshops and had visited a school to see Leela practicing the nursery rhymes that once sounded like home to Anna. When David and Leela arrived at the opening, the room stilled, not with faux theatrics, but with a real kind of reverence. People moved toward the painting as if approaching the edge of a familiar path. They read Anna's sentences aloud in small groups. Children pointed to pages and laughed at the same old jokes that Anna had kept in margins. The small handbook, printed in a compact run, was given to each classroom teacher in attendance. A plaque near the painting read, in plain type, Anna's name and the years of her life. It did not inflate her as a genius, nor diminish her as someone ordinary, just a true marker. Anna Weber, 1979-2024, teacher and artist. Her methods taught language as a practice of belonging. The phrasing was intentionally modest, reflecting the woman whose notebook refused flourish. Clara took the podium for a short speech, not to center herself, but to make clear the program's ongoing commitments. "We are here to continue the work Anna began," she said, "not with press releases, but with regular classrooms, funded scholarships, and a handbook that teachers can rely on. This is a promise I intend to keep." She named David publicly as a co-designer of the curriculum and asked him to speak. He stepped up with a quiet steadiness, the room folding into a softer silence. "We owe Anna more than memory," he said, in a voice that held no flourish but the kind of exactness people trust. "We owe her practice. I taught Leela what Anna taught me, how words live in small things. Tonight, we take those small things out into the light. That is what matters." When the official program drew to a close, people lingered by the painting, by the display cases, by the tables of modest snacks. Cameras that came for the headline left with footage that looked less sensational and more durable. A girl reciting verbs with a teacher, a woman handing a lesson plan to a father, a scholar comparing handwriting. At the very end of the evening, after the lights had dimmed and the crowds thinned, David, Leela, and Clara stood together before Anna's painting. The canvas caught the low light in the way oil does, deep, luminous, like a remembered afternoon. Leela, who had not yet let go of the coin, lifted it and held it together with the silver necklace between her palms, as if offering both to the world. The three of them created a small, quiet circle: the man who had learned German from love, the child who had found a coin and kept memory safe, and the young woman who had been a student and learned the labor of apology. No cameras recorded in that last hush. It was deliberately private, even in a public place. Clara reached down and fastened the necklace around Leela's small neck. "For you to wear," she said gently, "so that you always remember how important it is to listen." Leela's face brightened, surprised by the weight and the warmth. She reached up and placed the coin on top of the necklace, letting the two metals sit together like a small treaty forged between people. They stood that way for a long, unadvertised moment until the museum's closing bell nudged them back to ordinary time. Outside, the night air was cool, and the city moved on in its many small urgencies. The painting would travel, the scholarships would be awarded, the handbook would be printed again, revised by teachers in practice. The work, steady and careful, would outlast any single headline. In the days that followed, Clara visited classrooms regularly, sometimes standing at the back with a mug of coffee and listening. She learned the names of students as they learned to pair images with words. She wrote a short foreword to the handbook that acknowledged her misstep, spelled out timelines for funding, and invited community oversight. She did not make grand pronouncements every week. Instead, she sent lesson plans to teachers, attended meetings, and kept showing up. For his part, David drove to a small office the trust had set up to coordinate volunteer teachers. He sat at a folding table and, with the same patient clarity Anna had once used, worked to adapt exercises for children who had been moving between homes, who moved with their parents through different jobs that left little time for structured after-school enrichment. He taught volunteers how to make verbs into songs and how to fold kindness into correction. He was not a philanthropist. He was a man who had learned to keep a ledger of care. Leela, for her part, attended the first scholarship class and promptly announced to a room full of kids that their daily jingle should be sung like a secret and not a test. She corrected the pronunciation of a word with a childish certainty that made the teacher laugh. The anecdote made its way into the program's small newsletter and was printed in the handbook's anecdotal section. A child's correction is often the truest compass. Months later, when the painting was installed in a municipal gallery for a community tour stop, Clara gave a brief address. She spoke of accountability as a long-term project and told those gathered that restitution is measured in consistent offerings: time, funding, presence. She announced that the scholarship fund would be replenished with a yearly contribution from her family office and invited local donors to join. Reporters asked if this was enough. She answered in the only way that could be measured, by showing them attendance lists, lesson plans, and success stories from children who had learned to read the world in another tongue. The work's results were modest and steady: students who spoke more confidently, parents who felt invited into classrooms, teachers with materials they could trust. And the coin and the necklace remained, worn alternately by Lila and displayed when needed as small relics of the night that had forced a room to look at itself. They were symbols, yes, but they also became tools for teaching. The coin a token to open a conversation about lineage and belonging, the necklace a reminder of the human cost of careless speech. The story that began with a sharp sentence in German and with a man in a rented vest who refused to be preemptively diminished settled into something less viral and more rooted. People still recalled the shock of a father speaking his wife's language in a room that presumed he could not. They still shared the clip online. But the parts that held longest were the small daily reconciliations. The first class where students read aloud without shame. The scholarship letter from a parent who wrote to say a child now introduced themselves without fear. An email from a teacher who said, simply, "We used Anna's exercise today and 6 new words stuck." In quieter moments, David would return to Anna's notebook. He read her marginalia with a tenderness that never dulled. Tiny arrows, circled verbs, a doodled heart where she had meant to mark a triumphant exercise. He kept adding to it, small notes of his own, lessons he learned from classrooms he never imagined he'd teach. How patience beats.